The voice in my earpiece said, "Water's at the retaining wall. You have maybe 4 minutes before it tops." And I said, "I know, I'm standing in it." And the voice said, "Rafferty, get back from the wall." And I said, "In a minute." And the voice, and this is the part I keep coming back to, the voice said quietly, like it was just the two of us in a room instead of a flood emergency with 47 active calls stacking in Salt Lake County Dispatch. "Please." Nobody says please on an emergency channel. I got back from the wall. My name is Rafferty Lund. I'm 34 years old, and I work flood control and stormwater management for Salt Lake City Public Utilities, which means that in a normal year I spend my time maintaining channel infrastructure along the Jordan River corridor, monitoring flow gauges, clearing debris from culverts, and doing the kind of unglamorous, invisible work that keeps a city dry when the Wasatch snowpack decides to come down all at once. In a bad year, and this was a bad year. The kind of spring where the mountains held everything. Through a cold March and then a warm April arrived and the snow melt came down hard and fast, and the Jordan River remembered that it had opinions about its banks. In a bad year, I spent 30-hour shifts in waterproof, gear with a radio in one hand and a flow chart in the other, making decisions about where the water goes so it doesn't go somewhere worse. I am comfortable with water. I understand it the way you understand something you've been arguing with for 10 years. I know when it's manageable and I know when it's made up its mind. On the morning of April 14th at 6:22 a.m., the Jordan River was making up its mind. What I didn't know yet was who was on the other end of that radio and what that voice was going to cost me. The spring flood event had been building for 5 days. The National Weather Service had flagged the snowmelt acceleration on April 9th. By April 11th, the Jordan River was running at 340% of its April median flow. By the morning of April 14th, it had crested the secondary channel markers at 3 separate points between North Temple and 2100 South, and Salt Lake County Emergency Management had activated its flood response protocol at 4 a.m. I had been on site since 3:30. My team of 4 was deployed across the most critical channel sections, 2 at the 900 South Culvert Complex, 1 at the North Temple Diversion Gate, and me at the retaining wall segment near the old Surplus Canal Junction, which was the point I'd been watching most closely because the wall there was original 1960s construction and I did not trust it the way I trusted the newer sections. Flood control operates on radio and phone, constant contact with the operations center, with field teams, with emergency management. At 4:45 a.m., the County Dispatch Center patched into our operations frequency to establish joint coordination, which is standard protocol for a declared flood emergency. It means that from that point forward, when I key my radio, I'm talking to both my operations center and the 911 dispatch supervisor on duty. The dispatch supervisor on duty that morning was a man named Caspian Reeve. I know this because at 5:03 a.m., when I reported a flow rate anomaly at the retaining wall, the voice that came back to me was not my operations coordinator. It was someone else, calm, precise, with the specific quality of unhurried focus that comes from years of managing multiple emergencies simultaneously without letting any of them feel like they're being managed. Flood Control Lund. This is Dispatch Supervisor Reeve, SL County. Can you confirm your position and the nature of the anomaly? I'm at the Surplus Canal Junction retaining wall, 1200 South Corridor, I said. I'm seeing seepage through the wall face at 3 points. Not catastrophic yet, but the flow rate's increasing. If this wall goes, water reroutes into the Ballpark neighborhood storm drain system, which is already at capacity. A 2-second pause. Then, understood. I'm logging it and flagging emergency management. What do you need? Sandbag support at this position and a structural assessment team if anyone has one available, I said. On it. Keep this channel open, he kept me on. For the next 90 minutes, while my team worked the wall and the sandbag crew arrived and the water kept climbing, Caspian Reeve was in my ear, not constantly, not intrusively, but with the precise cadence of someone who understood the difference between useful communication and noise. He routed resources. He relayed upstream flow data from the NWS gauges. He told me, at one point, that a residential street 2 blocks east was showing water intrusion in 3 properties and asked me to confirm whether the storm drain at 1300 South was holding. It was, I told him. He thanked me, actually thanked me, which nobody does on an emergency channel, Or at least not like that. Not like the thank you meant something specific rather than just acknowledging receipt at 6:22 a.m. The water reached the top of the retaining wall, and I stepped closer to read the gauge on the wall face, and that was when he said, "Rafferty, get back from the wall." First name. We had been on channel for 90 minutes and he had called me Lund, or Flood Control Lund for all of it. And then suddenly it was Rafferty. Like something had slipped. Like the professional distance had held for 90 minutes and then the water got too close and it gave. And then, please, I got back from the wall. The wall held. Not because it was strong enough. It wasn't. Not really. But because the sandbag reinforcement bought enough time for the upstream diversion gate to be partially opened, redirecting flow into the surplus canal channel and reducing pressure on the junction segment. By 8:15 a.m., the river was still high, but the critical points were stabilized. By 10 a.m., the immediate crisis was downgraded. I was in my truck in the staging area, soaked through my waterproof gear in the way that only happens when you've been in active water for 4 hours, drinking the worst coffee I have ever tasted from a vending machine at the public works yard. When my radio clicked, "Flood Control Lund, this is Reeve, confirm status. Stable," I said. "Wall held. Drain system is clearing. We'll need a structural assessment on the 1200 South segment before the next rain event, but we're through the acute phase." "Good." A pause. "You got back from the wall." "You said please," I said. A longer pause. Then, and I could hear something in it. Not quite amusement, not quite relief. Something that lived between the two. I do that sometimes. When it matters. I looked at the worst coffee in Salt Lake City and thought about a voice that said, "Please" on an emergency channel, and meant it. "Reeve," I said. "Yeah." "What's your first name?" Another pause, longer than the others. "Caspian." "Caspian," I said. "I'm going to sleep for 6 hours and then I'm going to be back on the Jordan River. If you're on shift tomorrow, I'll be on this frequency." "I'm on shift tomorrow," he said. Like it was the simplest fact in the world. Like he had already known he was going to say it. I drove home and did not think about very much else. We talked on the radio for 4 more days before the flood event fully resolved. Not constantly. The emergency had downgraded to monitoring phase by day 2, which meant the joint dispatch coordination was scaled back. But Caspian kept the channel open for daily status checks, which was within protocol, but at the outer edge of it. And I kept filing detailed reports that were probably more thorough than the situation strictly required. And neither of us mentioned this. What I learned about Caspian Reeve in 4 days of radio contact. He had been a 911 dispatcher for 9 years, the last 3 as supervisor. He had started as a field EMT and moved to dispatch after an injury that he mentioned once, briefly, without elaborating. He had a habit of going quiet for exactly 2 seconds before responding to anything complex, which I came to recognize as the sound of someone processing completely before speaking. He knew the Jordan River corridor better than most dispatchers because he'd grown up in the Glendale neighborhood, 2 blocks from the river, and had watched it flood twice in his childhood. That last thing he told me on day 3, during a lull in the monitoring reports. Not information I needed, just something he wanted me to know. "You watched it flood as a kid and you ended up dispatching flood emergencies?" I said. "You watched it flood as a kid?" He guessed. "My family had property in Murray," I said. 983 event. I was 2. "My parents still talk about it. So we both ended up here," he said. "We both ended up here," I said. 2 seconds of quiet. Then, "Rafferty, yeah. When this event closes out, the joint coordination I'd like to keep talking. Not on this channel." I looked at the Jordan River, still high, still moving, still making up its mind about things. "Give me your number," I said. He did. We met in person 8 days after the flood event closed. He picked a place in the Granary district, a coffee shop on a corner, the kind of Salt Lake City neighborhood that sits between industrial and residential, and has decided to be neither and both. All exposed brick and good espresso and people who work with their hands or their minds, and sometimes both. I was early. He was earlier. I want to be precise here, because I had constructed a version of him from 9 days of radio contact, and I want to account for the distance between that construction and the actual person. He was quieter in person than on the radio, which surprised me, because on the radio he had been measured and calm, and I had taken that for his natural register. In person, the quiet was different. Not withdrawn, more like someone who had learned to take up exactly the space they needed and no more, which is a different thing entirely. He was 36. Dark eyes, the kind that are hard to read quickly and worth the time to read slowly. He had a stillness to him, not tension, the opposite of tension. The stillness of someone who has spent 9 years receiving other people's emergencies and has built, necessarily, a very stable interior. He stood when I came in, which I had not expected, and it disarmed me slightly, which I also had not expected. Rafferty Lund, he said. Caspian Reeve, I said. We shook hands. His grip was steady and unhurried, and he didn't look away. We sat down. The coffee shop was warm around us. Outside, the granary district was doing its mid-morning thing. Deliveries. Foot traffic, the specific Salt Lake City light that is cleaner than most cities' light. Something to do with the altitude and the air and the mountains that are always there to the east. Always available to orient you. You sound different in person, he said. Different how? He considered it. On the radio you sound like someone managing something, he said. In person you sound like someone who's done managing for the day. I looked at him. It's 10 in the morning. I know, he said. That's what I mean. And I thought, 9 days of radio contact and he already knows where I keep the weight. We talked for 2 hours. I learned that he had grown up in Glendale with his grandmother after his parents moved to California. That the neighborhood, the river, the specific quality of Salt Lake City's spring light were things he had chosen by staying when he could have left. That he had a younger brother in Provo he saw most Sundays. That the EMT injury had been a back injury from a patient lift, not dramatic, just the kind of thing that accumulates and then one day becomes a decision. That he had been in dispatch long enough to know the difference between the people who called because they were scared and the people who called because something was actually wrong, and that the skill of knowing which was the thing he was most proud of professionally. What does it sound like? I asked. The difference? He thought about it. The scared ones talk fast and loud, he said. The ones with the real thing, they get very precise, very specific. They say exactly what's happening without editorializing. He paused. You do that. On the radio. Is that a compliment? In my world, he said, it's the highest one. I thought about a voice that said please on an emergency channel. About the specific precision of waters at the retaining wall. You have maybe 4 minutes. About the 2 seconds of quiet before he said anything that mattered. You do it too, I said. He looked at me steadily. I know, he said. I think that's why this is easy. It was easy. That was the strange thing. It was the easiest thing I'd done in years. We were careful with each other in the early weeks. Not guarded. Just deliberate. The way people are deliberate when they've been careless before and remember what that cost. He worked rotating shifts. Dispatch doesn't stop for weekends or holidays or the particular inconvenience of human schedules. I worked early mornings and long field days during active season. The overlap was real but narrow, and we used it well. He started texting me the Jordan River gauge readings every morning, not because I couldn't get them myself, but because he checked them anyway, as habit, as the inheritance of a childhood 2 blocks from a river that flooded, and one day he just started sending them to me with one line of context. Gauge at 900s up 0.3 from yesterday. Upstream precip last night. The first time I got it, I stared at my phone for a moment before I understood what he was doing. He was accounting for me in the logistics of his morning. Quietly, without making a thing of it, I started sending him the weather forecast for the Wasatch Front every evening. The version I pulled from the NWS site. With the snowpack data and the melt projections. The information that told me what the river was going to do before the river knew. His world, routed through my data. My data, made useful to his world. You okay? He'd text on the hard days. Not often, but correctly timed, which told me he was paying attention. I keep being, I'd write back. My father's phrase, the one that meant more than fine and less than perfect. The one that told the truth without requiring elaboration. Me too, he'd write. Every time. The second event came in late May. Not a flood, a near miss. A debris dam had formed overnight at the 2100 South Culvert, backing water into a residential area faster than the monitoring system caught it. I got the field call at 5 a.m. and was on site in 20 minutes. Caspian was already on his shift. He'd caught the 911 calls from residents on the affected street and had been routing resources. For 11 minutes before I arrived, we worked it on separate channels for the first hour. Then the incident commander patched us together, and I heard his voice in my ear again for the first time since April. Calm, precise, the 2-second pause before anything complex. The specific quality of someone who had processed more emergencies than most people could count and had come out the other side, not hardened but clarified. The debris dam was cleared by 8 a.m., minimal property damage, no injuries. Afterward, in the staging area, I called him on his personal number instead of the radio. He picked up on the second ring. Good outcome, he said. Before I could say anything, good outcome, I said. A pause. Then, you're wet again. How do you know that? You always sound slightly different when you're wet. Shorter sentences. I looked down at my waterproof gear, soaked through in the same way as April, and laughed. A real one, the kind that surprises you. The kind that comes from being correctly seen by someone who's been paying close enough attention to notice the difference in your voice when you're standing in water. Caspian, I said. Yeah. I'm going to dry off and then I'm coming to meet you when your shift ends, I said. I don't want to do this on the phone anymore. 2 seconds of quiet. The sound of him processing completely. My shift ends at 2, he said. I'll be there at 2, I said. He came out of the dispatch center at 2:03. Still in his work clothes, and found me leaning against my truck in the parking lot. The May afternoon was warm, Salt Lake City in late May. The mountains still holding snow on the upper elevations. The valley floor already into its long, dry summer. And the light was the clean, flat light of the high desert. The kind that doesn't hide anything. He stopped a few feet away. We looked at each other in the actual light, not through a radio, not across a coffee shop table, just in the open. In the afternoon, with nothing between us. I've been thinking about something, he said. Tell me, I said. On the radio in April, he said. When I said your name, your first name, he looked at me steadily. I didn't mean to. It came out because, he paused, because the water was too close and I stopped thinking about the channel and started thinking about you. The parking lot was quiet around us. Somewhere across the valley, the Jordan River was running at its late May level, still elevated, still working, still moving through the city it had been moving through for longer than the city had existed. I know, I said. I got back from the wall. You got back from the wall, he said. Something shifted in his expression, the stillness that was his natural state giving way to something less managed, something warmer. I've been thinking about that too. I closed the distance between us. Not all of it, just enough, the way you move when you're not performing anything and you want to be near something that matters. 4 inches, 5. His face fully in the afternoon light, open and certain, and exactly what I had spent 6 weeks on a radio and in a coffee shop and in the logistics of morning texts learning it was. Caspian, I said. Yeah, he said. Quiet, ready. I got back from every wall, I said. The whole time. Because of that one word. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached up and put his hand briefly at my jaw. Warm, unhurried, certain. And the mountains were behind us, and the river was below us, and the city was going about its enormous ordinary business all around us. And none of it was as loud as the 2 seconds of quiet before he said, I know. There is a recording in the Salt Lake County Emergency Management Archive. Standard protocol. All joint coordination channels are logged from the morning of April 14th. 93 minutes of flood emergency radio traffic. Jordan River overflow event, Surplus Canal Junction. If you listened to all 93 minutes, you would hear 2 people doing their jobs with everything they had. You would hear flow rates and resource requests and sandbag deployments and storm drain status reports. You would hear at the 67th minute a voice say Rafferty, get back from the wall, and another voice say in a minute, and the first voice say, quietly, please. You would hear at the 91st minute, the wall hold. What the recording doesn't capture is what that please cost, the small breach in professional distance. The first name said without deciding to say it. The moment a dispatcher stopped managing a channel and started thinking about a specific person standing in cold water next to an old wall in the dark. What it doesn't capture is the decision made in that moment, on both ends of that radio, without either of us knowing we were making it. The river runs south through Salt Lake City the way it always has, through the neighborhoods that grew up beside it, past the retaining walls that hold it where the city needs it held, toward the lake that has been shrinking for years and keeps going anyway. It doesn't care about the decisions made on its banks. It doesn't care about the people who watch its gauges or route its emergencies or grew up 2 blocks away and chose to stay. But I care about all of those things. I have always cared about exactly those things. And now I care about them next to someone who said please in the dark when it mattered and meant every letter of it, the level it holds. That's everything.